Welcome to MyFS. I'm Declan Curry. This is the first in a series of debates on the big issues in financial services. You can see all of them on the MyFS website. That's myfs-events.co.uk. And we'll keep you up to date on Twitter. Look for the hashtag MyFS. Today, the Pensions Minister tells us how we should pay for retirement. Leading industry experts and an invited audience tell us if his plans will work. So welcome to the MyFS debate on retirement funding. The hashtag on Twitter is MyFS. Let me tell you who our panellists are today. Steve Webb is one of the few politicians who understands pensions and probably the only one who's been able to do anything about them. He's the Pensions Minister in the coalition government. He's also that most endangered of species, a Liberal Democrat MP. He represents Thornbury and Yate. Stephanie Condra has 15 years of experience in the investment industry and more. She's also got a global perspective. She's worked in Canada and the Irish Republic before settling in London. She's a retirement marketing strategist at AXA Investment Management. Neil Lovatt is a director at Scottish Friendly. He's responsible for all aspects of marketing, product development and distribution channels, a role that he's held for the last 8 years. And Steve B is a noted commentator on financial services, the voice of the people who pay for the products. He's a blogger, a public speaker, a cartoonist. He's the founder and chief executive of the employee benefits platform, Jargonfree Benefits. Thank you to the four of you for being with us today. Steve Webb, as the Minister, we'll start with you. Give us an outline of the salient points of the changes that you're bringing in.
We've tried to adopt a sequential approach, get the foundations right first, so sort out the state pension, which is often neglected. We needed to simplify it, we needed to get people clear of means testing so that when they save, they can be confident they're better off. We also needed to make the state pension system sustainable, so we've raised state pension ages and will continue to do so. Having got that foundation in place, we needed millions of people into workplace saving, hence automatic enrolment. We're now halfway through that, so 5 million workers enrolled in the last couple of years, hugely successful. We then said, well, what's the products they've been enrolled into? There were virtually no quality standards when we started at all. So we've had to put in place charge caps, governance standards, ban certain sorts of charges altogether, give people confidence in the product. And then people said, yes, but what do they do when they've built up this pot of money? What happens at the other end? Hence the budget freedoms, which say it's your pot of money. You should be able to spend it as you wish. We'll make sure people get free, independent guidance to help them make those choices, but ultimately it's their money. Finally, in the current session of Parliament, we're looking at models of risk sharing in workplace pensions. So instead of going from one extreme of final salary, hard pensions paid for by the employer, to every individual with their own little pot, all the risk on the individual, trying to find places where employees and employers can share risk, or where employees in a scheme can pool risk, as is common on the continent and elsewhere. So a big programme of reform, but I think coherent, sequential, and in a much better place at the end of this Parliament than we were at the start.
And we'll look at the most recent reforms in just a moment. But to get your thought on this, was it your view that the financial industry was not fit for purpose?
We wouldn't have had to have a charge cap if we were confident that the process of the market and the industry would deliver value. And we were concerned that if you're putting millions of people into a pension, you're defaulting them into pension saving, they're making no active choices about their money. If they can't be confident they're not going to be ripped off, then we have a problem. So many firms are offering good value, but it's the tail. It's always the tail of the distribution you have to worry about.
Neil Lovatt, do you share that analysis from the Minister on the state of the industry as it was?
Yeah, I think it's right that the tail of the industry, there was a lot of problems in certain aspects of the industry. At the same time, there's been some great progress made in the industry, and I think the charge cap's built on that. But if you're looking at compulsory products, I think then a charge cap is absolutely the right way to go, and the government had done that previously through the child trust funds where they had a similar charge cap, and I think it's or a stakeholder default charge, and I think that's absolutely the right way to go.
Minister, the most recent changes are to give people more freedom, easier access to their pension savings, more choice over when and where and how much they draw out. What was the thinking behind that?
I think previous governments have been very paternalistic. You know, we give people tax relief. That must be to buy a pension. It must be to take your pot and shape it through your retirement. We, the government, know the right answer. We know what's best for you. Leave it to us. And what we've done is, first of all, the state pension reforms enabled us to be more relaxed about what people do with their money. Because once we've got people to a floor, then actually if they do spend their own pot, they're not necessarily making a call on the state. So our reforms enabled that to happen, but philosophically the coalition has been less paternalistic, has said our presumption is individuals are the best judge of what works for them. Yes, these are quite sophisticated decisions, so they need equipping, but actually whether you're single, whether you're married, whether you're healthy, whether you're ill, whether you want to travel, whether you want to leave money to your kids, you know that. The government doesn't know that. So we've got to start from the presumption individuals shape their retirement wealth.
Stephanie Condra, do you share the Minister's view that people are the best judge of where, when and how they should use their retirement savings?
Absolutely. I'd say these changes were certainly welcomed. The idea of flexibility and choice, give the individual the ability to choose whatever solution is right for them given their individual circumstances. The challenge, though, is that what's right for me is not exactly the same thing that's right for you or someone else. And that's kind of the issues or the challenges that we're going to have to address.
I mentioned in the introduction that you have experience of how pension markets work in other nations, and Australia is an interesting illustrative example here of how sometimes when you give people that level of freedom, they prioritise the short term rather than the long term.
Certainly, and we like to look at Australia because we'd like to think of it as more the mature market, whereas the UK is perhaps the teenager that's going through a little bit of growing pains. What we saw in Australia, though, is that as people approached retirement, their debt level actually increased. And so in a time when you should be paying down your debt and looking to replace your income in retirement, instead people were building up their debt and taking their retirement pot. And actually about 1/3 of people in Australia take their retirement pot to pay down debt or to buy a new home. Makes sense, it's a good financial decision, but what they aren't thinking about is the fact that they need to replace their income in retirement.
But at a time when they're losing the ability to replace that income, isn't that the danger of these reforms?
Exactly right. And the reforms and people's actions need to be focused on replacing that income for themselves, not making financial decisions, short-term financial decisions that might benefit them for a couple of years.
Minister, if I remember correctly, you said you were quite relaxed if people took their pension money and bought a Lamborghini with it.
I did, yes.
Other fast cars are available.
Famously, yes. But it kind of illustrates the point that, I mean, it's this issue, for example, in coming up to retirement, if you know you've got a pension pot, actually is borrowing money necessarily irrational? You know, actually, if you're fit, healthy, you're something you really want to spend the money on now, it's actually potentially quite patronising to say, I know best, that's wrong for you. You're absolutely right, I quite agree. We need people to make those decisions in an informed way, to realise they might be retired for 20 or 30 years, but I don't presume that I know that that's the wrong thing to do. I think the other thing about Australia is people sort of say, oh, well, in Australia, they're turning to annuities, and just as we're giving up. But I mean, that kind of starting from roughly 0, and we're starting from close to 100. Yeah, there is a place in the middle.
Neil Lovatt, your concern is that if people do blow all their money in the short term and then live a lot longer than they expect, the taxpayer ends up picking up that bill.
Yeah, my concern is there's a grand generational bargain when it comes to pensions, because we're talking about people's, it's their money for their pension pot, yeah, fair enough, but there is also taxpayers' money in those pension pots, and that's there to encourage people to save and to make sure they've got provision for their retirement, so they're not falling back onto the welfare state in later life. My concern is that if someone does take the money and buys a Lamborghini, fine, good luck to them, but I don't want to also carry on as a taxpayer. I don't want to be funding their income in retirement when the Lamborghini's been driven off the road or is depreciated in so much in value. And you know, we do have the single tier pension, but there's a lot of people who won't qualify for the full single tier pension and are still going to fall back on means tested benefits. And that's a concern. That's a concern for me as a taxpayer. And frankly, I would have thought that this government, of all governments, would want to protect the taxpayer out of this. So, I mean, I'm all in favour of the reforms. I just think we haven't buttoned down the edges of some of this. And we really need to make sure that we're protecting the taxpayer at the same time.
Minister, what's your response?
Although it's true lots of people in the early years don't get the full single tier pension, mainly that's the people who are contracted out. And they've got a guaranteed pension, often from a final salary scheme, which will also get them up to the single tier level. So the vast bulk of people we're talking about who've got a pension pot worth talking about will have a state pension plus a DB pension that gets them clear of pension credit. We're abolishing the savings credit. Most of them don't rent, so they won't get housing benefit. Very few of them will be poor enough, unless they really go mad, to get help with their council tax. So the only real exposure, I think, for the taxpayer is social care, probably 20 years hence. And for those people, frankly, whether they blow a 30,000 pension pot and don't have £30 a week, it's going to make blow all difference to whether they, social care's £700 a week. It's in the margins. And of course, in the grand scheme of things, if people do more pension saving because pensions are popular, which we think they will, net, the taxpayer might even benefit. So the OBR are not asking us to put in huge amounts of future public spending for these reforms.
Yeah, but
sorry,
the only thing I was going to say is that if people who've contracted out, and I agree that that's probably at the edge of this, there are going to be lots of people who've contracted out into money purchase schemes who are going to have a money purchase pot that they're going to be able to take, and that's taxpayer funded, and blow that on the Lamborghini and still then fall back on the state. So at the edge of this, I think that's where the problem is, and that's what I'm saying. I don't think we've buttoned down the edges of this, and I think that there are a number of areas where I think we really need to be really careful about the reforms, because from a taxpayer's point of view, I really do not want to be paying twice.
Yeah, I guess I'd say the vast bulk of contracting out historically has been DB, not DC. And also the personality types we're talking about. On the whole, someone who voluntarily, frugally puts way beyond the legal minimum aside for a rainy day, on the whole isn't the same person who then goes crazy in retirement. Some will. I'm not saying nobody will do this, but our estimates are that this is a tiny issue and the big prize is freedom.
So if the issue is tiny, then why not protect the taxpayer? Because it will be such a small change.
By doing what?
You can make you could make the pensions freedom conditional on you having at least 35 years service, or having a minimum income that at least takes you out of means testing. I don't understand why we can't have a minimum income that makes sure you're not going to end up being a burden on the taxpayer. Then take the money and buy your Lamborghini, as long as I'm not paying twice as a taxpayer.
You're immediately adding massive complexity, because people are means tested as households, for example. So it doesn't actually matter if I blow the lot, as long as my wife's worked hard all her life. Between us, we're not going to claim means tested benefits. So you're going to have to test the household before the individual makes a choice about each individual pot, because really actually what matters is the whole, not just each pot. You're adding massive complexity to something we're trying to simplify.
Sorry, but it's not complex, because we already run this system where we've got effectively pension freedom above a certain level.
Only for individuals, not for households.
Yeah, so I'm saying you could run it for individuals. All I'm saying is you could bring down the minimum income guarantee to a level and make sure that the individual is not going to be means tested.
Steve B, can people be trusted with their money?
Well, I do think so. I mean, we can always sit around and talk about just how many angels there are on any particular pinhead or anything like that. You've got to put some of this in perspective, right? 15, 20 years ago, we had a pension system that was rubbish, where the vast majority of people heading for retirement were going to end up with means-tested support of one kind or another. This guy has stopped that happening. I think you've done a great job, by the way. I think all the pension ministers we had before just couldn't do it between them. We finally got the changes we need. We've got what Beveridge tried to give us in the 1940s. We've got a subsistence level pension system, basic pension called the single tier pension. Strange name, bad name, but it's we've got a subsistence level pension, and above that we can build our own pensions if we want to, or build our own future wealth if we want to. It's not intertwined with this. State and private pensions are no longer intertwined. As they've been hopelessly intertwined, so that these things you're talking about, Neil, have happened. That won't happen again. The state pension is separate, and your own private pension savings are separate. I didn't believe, if you'd asked me 15 years ago, if I'd have heard a minister in the government, a pensions minister, talking about pension savings as people's own money, I would have loved that day to arrive. We're very lucky that day's arrived here. People can be trusted with their own money, and if they can't, why on earth do people, employers, for instance, give people salaries to take home? Why not give the money to the government to spend for them? That's a nonsense argument. What you need is to know that nobody falls back on the state in retirement. A subsistence level pension does that. You might argue about the level of it, but that's a debate for future politicians. What we've got now is a pension system that does right by people, and we had a pension system before that did wrong by savers. That was crazy.
You keep referring to it as their own money, but there is an argument that not all of it is. If you've been paying into your pension and you've had a reasonably well-paid job that's put you in the higher tax brackets, you've been getting tax relief on that money.
No, that's nonsense. That's an argument you'd only make if you don't know what's going on. That you don't get tax relief on pensions, right? You just don't. What you do, the deal with pensions is that if you put money aside, probably for decades, maybe for 50 years or more, the deal is you'll only pay income tax on that money once in your life. That's the deal. That's not a great deal for pensions. You know, go home and explain that, you know, I've got a fabulous deal on this. I can put money away for decades, and listen to this, I'll only be taxed once on it. You know? That's the deal. It's a question of the timing of, you know, when you draw it as income, that's when you pay tax. The fact that tax rates change over time is interesting, but not really relevant. And loads of people come out with crazy arguments now, saying higher rate taxpayers get away with this, and you know, all that sort of nonsense. It's not true. The real risk, I'd say, is that people, the tax rates at the moment, basic rate of tax is very, very low, 20%. When I started work, it was 35%, the basic rate of tax. I remember when it came down to 33%, it was front page news. You know? Wow, we keep 2/3 of our money now. You know? That's really, you know, went down to 30, 25, 20%. That's very low. You've got a lot of people now who are deferring tax, not paying tax on the money they save, who may well find that when they get to retirement, the tax rate's 35% again or more. That's the real risk. That, you know, in these days where we've got computers, we ought to seriously look at whether each tranche of saving you make could be taxed eventually at the rate of tax you would have paid on it when you first earned it. That would be an interesting debate.
Just as an aside, Minister, the tax relief as it currently stands for payments into personal pensions, will they remain as they currently are, including full relief for higher rate payers?
I'd be very surprised if the next government, whoever it is, leaves it alone. I mean, partly austerity and all of that, they're going to be looking for money. And I don't wholly disagree with what Steve just said, in fact, particularly not the first bit. But I do struggle with the notion that if I want to put £1 into my pension, it costs me 60 pence. And if someone who works in my office wants to put £1, it costs them 80 pence. Now, I accept that the chances are, you know, there's an issue about what tax rate we'll all be paying when we retire. But I just think, if, given that we know the people who are under-saving for pensions are the people who pay at the standard rate, not the people who pay at the higher rate, if there is an amount of revenue foregone in this year, I would want to allocate it differently to the way we do now, and I'd probably take some money out while I was at it because we need to. And I just think what we mustn't do is keep fiddling, nibbling, changing this allowance, tweaking that one. And one of the beauties of a flat rate relief, which is what I'd like to see, is you could abolish complexity like the lifetime limit. Because if you've got a sensible rate of relief now, an annual limit to stop people going beyond a certain amount, I don't think you need all the complexity of a lifetime limit.
And that is your view,
yes.
But it is also your view that any Chancellor, whoever it is after the next election, would want to look at this again.
We'll have a look in that particular pool of money, yeah.
I would have thought that the tax-free lump sum would be an interesting area where the government may look at, because one of the things that when Steve was talking about taxation or the benefits of tax relief, what you can do right now is you can put £5,000 into a pension right now, and then you can take it straight out the next day, and through washing that through on a basic rate tax, you can walk away with £5,312.50. So that comes because of the tax-free lump sum. So I mean, I'm all in favour of letting people time their tax. That's fine, and as long as they're paying tax. But the tax-free lump sum, I think, again, is just another area where I think this government or any future government is going to have to look at.
Steve B, quick thought.
Well, tax-free cash is the one real benefit of saving in a private pension. Without it, you'd be crazy to put your money into a pension, quite honestly.
Well, I'm sorry. I think the taxpayer's got to look at the fact that if it's paying, if you're taking £5,000, washing it straight through a pension and walking away with £5,300, is that good value for them?
There's a limit to the amount anybody can pay into their pension.
Well,
well, no, we've agreed that there's a certain amount of money that we can pay into a pension. Nobody can pay more than they're allowed to pay. Does it matter when they do it? No, of course not.
I'm not saying when.
I'm
not disagreeing on when they take it out. I'm talking about the tax-free lump sum.
You're saying that if you do it at the last minute, it's worse than if you do it decades before.
No, not at all. No, I didn't say that. I said it specifically on the effect of the tax-free lump sum. The tax-free lump sum allows you to wash through and effectively take taxpayers' money. Now, that is definitely, that's the math of it. And it definitely is the case that is something that a future government's going to have to look at. I have no problem with people timing their tax. I think that is absolutely right in everything you said. However, over the long term, that equation doesn't change. And the tax-free lump sum allows pensioners to benefit from taxpayers' money. And it comes back to what I said earlier. If I'm paying taxpayers, if taxpayers are putting money into pensions, then they should be protected, to me, in all circumstances, from someone falling back onto welfare.
Okay, Steve B, briefly, and then we'll move on.
Well, I think we now have people not subject to means testing and the devaluation of their pension savings. I think we live in fabulous times, I really do, where we're sitting here on a panel discussing how people should spend their pension money and not that they don't have it or may not have it. I think I'm glad these days have arrived.
Okay, Stephanie, when you hear the programme of reform that the Minister outlines, what does that mean for the retirement savings industry? Does it mean you need to tweak what you were doing already, or does it involve a more fundamental rethink?
What's interesting is the needs of individuals haven't changed. They still need income in retirement. And there are a lot of products out in the market that provide income. They might not have been labelled retirement products. They might not have been described as being able to provide income in retirement, but there are some products out there. That being said, there's probably still some work to be done to develop some new products, because income is a need, but maybe inflation protection, maybe capital protection. There's a few other needs that people will have in retirement. So there is some room for kind of growth and innovation, but I'd say that it's not a blank sheet of paper that we're starting with.
So new products, the attributes would be, the purpose of them would be what?
To meet the needs of investors in retirement. And importantly, that's how they should be positioned, and that's how they should be designed, outcome-oriented. Income, inflation protection, capital protection, longevity protection. These are the needs of people in retirement. So these are the kind of products that should be developed, not a product that is meant to beat the equity index by 4%. That's not what people in retirement are looking for. It might be a tool that they use, but it's not the need that they have, and that's not the need that they describe when they're talking to either their peers, an advisor, or a guidance service about what they're looking for. And what
Neil Lovatt.
Yeah, well, just if I can be positive for once. I mean, I actually think that, I mean, it's the best part of the reforms that there's going to be. I mean, you can take what pensions are just now and just forget they exist. I mean, it's just not going to exist like that in the future. You're going to see a Cambrian explosion in the evolution of products in the pensions market. You're not just going to have pensions. People are going to have a series of assets that are going to be wrapped in a pension. Some of them may be wrapped in ISAs, and they're going to have different buckets for different things. You're going to see the industry evolve a huge number of different products. I mean, I can quite easily foresee pension products that you can use to pay your grandkids' school fees, that you could pay your kids' university fees. There's a whole host of different applications that could
money.
Yeah, exactly. But that's the beauty of it. We need to almost just step back from thinking of this as pensions and start thinking of this as, okay, these are going to be lots of different pots that people are going to have, and they're going to use for lots of different purposes. The negative side of that is you just got to watch, because there's going to be some strange products that are going to evolve in the industry, and the regulator's going to have to be very wary of them. I'm waiting for the first buy-to-let pension to come up. It'll happen some way. There'll be some way in which the buy-to-let industry is going to muscle in on that market, and it's going to be something that the regulator's going to have to really be wary of. But it's the innovation that's going to come from the industry in the next few years is going to be quite remarkable.
Just looking at some of the old familiars, Steve B, what do these reforms mean for annuities?
Well,
do they survive?
No, I think they do. I think annuities, I think that people don't understand annuities. They're true insurance products, right? If you don't know when you're going to die, you can insure against living longer than your money. That's a great thing to buy into. I don't think annuities have been put to people in that way, because there's been no need to. You had to have an income from an arbitrary point in the middle of your older years, and that income was sufficient for all your needs on a one-size-fits-all basis. That's where we've come from. So no one, I'd argue that our annuity industry in this country hasn't been very good or been given much chance to sell the real benefits of annuities. Strangely enough, I think the outcome of these reforms will be that in the far future, we'll see many more people actively choosing annuities as good insurance products for them later in life. Not for all their money maybe, but for some of it.
Neil, you're shaking your head.
Yeah, I think the reforms are probably going to be yet another nail in the coffin of annuities. The big problem is when you don't have to select an annuity, who's going to buy an annuity? The people who are going to buy annuities are going to be people who are not like me, who drink too much, who are overweight, and who smoke. Sorry, Mum, I smoke every now and then. They're not going to be the sort of people who are going to buy annuities. The people who buy annuities are people who are going to have long lives, who are going to expect to beat the system, who think, I'm going to live for a long, long time. The industry know that. That's going to start getting priced in. You're just not going to have people with poorer health buying annuities, and it's going to push the annuity market out further and further.
Let me just make a note. Better deals for those who drink too much.
Yep. there are annuities you can get.
That could well be very helpful indeed. Stephanie, what do you think this does for annuities?
Yeah, I'm shaking my head a little bit there, Neil, and it's just because I think, as Steve mentioned, annuities are insurance. We buy car insurance for the risk that something happens to us when we're on the road. We buy house insurance, the risk that something happens to our most precious asset. Why wouldn't we buy insurance to the risk that we might live too long? A philosophy of any investment is that you hedge the risk, or you buy insurance on the risk that you can't afford to take and you can't afford to outlive your money. Yeah. So I think if that's the way we position it, that annuities will still stand. Not at 65, but maybe at 70.
But my concern is the price. I mean, the problem is people don't like buying annuities right now because of the price. That price is going to go out further and further. I mean, look, I come from Glasgow. 2 miles down the road from me in Glasgow Colton, the average male life expectancy is 54. Okay, so if you're a male in Glasgow Colton and you give them £50,000 as a pension fund, at 65, you've technically been dead for 11 years. You shouldn't be buying an annuity. You should be using that money. That's not advice, by the way. But it's that's going to be the problem. You're going to find people in Glasgow Colton aren't going to be purchasing annuities because the price just isn't in their favour.
Well, annuity rates will always be priced right. There are loads of clever people in machinery who can do it. If the price is right and people want to pay that price for the insurance, they'll pay it. The price is what the price is.
Yeah, the price is going to be skewed by the people who are now buying it, and it's going to be people who are living longer and longer and longer.
I'm sure there'll be a market. I don't think
I don't disagree there's not going to be a market.
Stephanie, is the inevitable consequence of these reforms that more and more of the risk of financing retirement is being devolved onto the shoulders of individuals? There's less risk being taken by the state and by employers.
Absolutely, absolutely. Very clearly, that's the consequence of flexibility and choice. As DB schemes close, as DB assets grow, the risk is set on the shoulders of the individual. And I think that there could be some things that the government could do, maybe as they move from teenage years into adult years, to help manage some of that risk. We've seen it in Australia actually just last week, the introduction of a default solution in retirement, so that people at least have a starting point where maybe there's some longevity protection in there, maybe there's some income in there, and then people still have the flexibility and choice to move out of that solution if they think there's something better for them out there.
Minister, are you comfortable with the increasing risk on the shoulders of voters?
No, that's partly, if you think about the accumulation phase, that's where I'm most worried that we've shifted all the risk essentially from employers to individuals, and I don't think individuals are well placed to cope with that volatility, hence the risk sharing and risk pooling models. So we want to see more sharing of risk and pooling of risk. In terms of retirement, the bit that I think we haven't quite got right still is later retirement and people's financial capability later in retirement. You know, okay, I'm 55, 60, I make a choice with a guidance session, but I'm 78, have I then locked into annuity or whatever, you know, what's the right default in later retirement? Are we expecting people to make active financial choices all the way through the retirement when, you know, all of us become less able to do that? And I think there's more to be done on trying to protect the old elderly.
Less able and less willing.
Yes.
People don't want to be making decisions throughout their life.
One of the interesting things of the industry is that in the last 20 years is we've pushed investment risk onto individuals and asked them to manage their money. We're now effectively asking them to manage longevity risk. Now, outside the actuarial profession, I don't really know many people who fundamentally understand longevity risk. I mean, and we're going to end up with some people who are going to run out of money because they've just lived much longer than they expected to.
Steve B, this brings us back to the risk that many have highlighted from the very start with these reforms. There is now a greater danger of people running out of money.
Well, there always was, and I don't think any of this changes that. The one thing that might change that, in a good way, is that more people will be being nudged into saving money in the first place, and that has to help. if we could have gone ahead with the things that Keith Joseph tried to do in 1974, we'd have been in a much better position now. We're now in a position where the state has told us exactly where it stands with state pensions. First time for 100 years we've had that clarity, and now we can build our own savings on top of that. Now, whether we want to take the risk as savers or not, I mean, DB schemes, I like DB schemes. I was lucky enough to be in a couple, very nice for me. My employer took all the risks associated with that, the longevity risk and also the investment risk. As employers switch from DB to DC, which they are, because it's become too difficult to have that hanging around on your balance sheet, they've given all the risks to the individuals. Steve Webb and other people are saying, well, maybe there's a middle ground where there's risk sharing. I quite like what they do in America, where they have things which I think they call cash balance schemes, where an employer would say, this is a defined benefit scheme I've got for you, but it's not defined in terms of pension benefit, but a cash benefit. So you'll get maybe 10 times your earnings at retirement. On the day you retire, I'll hand it to you. I'll take the investment risk of making sure I can get 10 times your earnings ready, but I'm not going to underwrite the longevity risk in the future. 10 times your earnings sounds a lot better than a company pension scheme. You go home, I'm going to get 10 times pay, right? Actually, a good final salary pension scheme from the 60s and 70s would have been 20 times earnings or more, right? I think that a better discussion in the workplace between employers and employees is one where they might share the risks in ways that will turn the employees on to pension saving and thinking their employers are doing a good job. I don't think we've got all of those options on the table at the moment in the current debate. I think cash, I know you don't agree with me, but I think cash is what people understand, and I think cash is something that is much easier to aim at, and you know you're aiming at a certain amount of money, and I do think you can be trusted to live off your own money, and if you can't, good God, we've got problems wider than this.
I disagree with you, Steve. I don't think that people necessarily understand or know what to do with a big pot of cash. They know what to do when you talk to them about income. For 40 years, you make a salary and you get your income and you make your financial decisions based on this income that's coming in every year. Then all of a sudden you retire and you're like, okay, we're not going to talk about income anymore. Here's your pot. Now go figure out what you want to do with your pot. I do think that anything that is developed, any communication, any solution, needs to be focused on this idea of income, because people are used to making decisions based on that income they're expecting, not on what am I supposed to do with this gigantic pot of money.
Well, if I'm a 65-year-old at retirement, I've got a 50% probability of living another 20 years. I've got a 10% probability of living into my 90s. How do I manage a pot of money to cater for that kind of probability risk? It's just something that's exceptionally difficult. So I do think the industry is going to have to innovate some quite significant products to allow people to at least cover off those longevity risks.
Well, I read something recently that said most people over 60 in the world, not just our country, don't work, right? And most people under 60 do. I mean, across the piece. I'm worried that there's, and we've mentioned it on this already. We talk about something called retirement, as though it's a concept, as though it's something real. Right? I'm worried that because we have something called retirement stuck in our heads, we do stupid things like stop working when we're physically okay. Right? One great way of getting income when you're older is to work. Sell your time. That's what we're all doing here today. You sell your time, someone gives you money for it. Why stop because you've reached an age where everybody else seems to think something called retirement happens? Crazy, right? We're conditioning
For some workers, it's because they're knackered and they're not capable of it.
No.
Exactly.
Some headlines already.
Yeah.
That's a debate that people have been having for years and years and years, and it's a nonsense debate.
It's not a nonsense debate if you're repairing roofs or you're a scaffolder and you're not physically capable of doing it after 60.
Well, you don't. No. Now you're making the assumption that just because you did something once in your life, that's all you're ever going to do. I think you're doing people a disservice. People are great, right? We'll do a large number of things. A lot of people who are older, my dad's 88 at the moment. He works every day. He doesn't get paid for much of it, but he works every day, right? He wants to be active. Why give up working just because other people think you should?
Oh, I don't dispute
The
that.
good
I'm
thing
just
about
saying
money-
it's a very middle-class office job perspective.
No. I don't. Yeah, I think those arguments just aren't right. Right? Anybody can change what they do later on. You can do something less onerous, something that you might prefer to do, and using your income not for all of your savings, not for all of your income, but to top up your income. So you might work 2 or 3 days a week doing something you actually like to do rather than what you had to do when you had kids and all that sort of thing to support. And you can draw on your savings to help you do that. Annuities didn't allow you to do that because they were never built with an on-off switch. Giving people this kind of reform, this kind of control, effectively gives them annuities or whatever they want to call them with on-off switches. I think it's great.
I do think that the length of time that you work for is the crucial variable we often miss because we do pensions. And Steve's absolutely right. We have what we call a fuller working lives agenda, which is partly about doing different things later in life, as Steve says. And I think the huge cultural shift is going to come in 2018. Because in 2018, nobody's pension age will be 65 anymore. So we've already abolished forced retirement at 65 in this Parliament. After 2018, nobody will draw a state pension at 65 anymore. And suddenly our whole society that's been geared around the magic numbers of 60 and 65 will just have to think differently. You choose when you stop work, by and large, and that's how you plan for retirement.
Not everyone chooses when they
That's what I say,
stop
by and
work.
large,
You know, the numbers of people who at the age of 50 and above are eased out of their job are still shockingly high.
But they are changing. I mean, the bit of the labour market that's held at best in the last 5 years has been the over 50s. You know, we gave over 3,000 apprenticeships to the over 60s in this Parliament. You know, with the nature of you know, we know that the number of workers under 45 is going to shrink by 750,000 by the end of this decade. Number of workers over 50 is going to rise by 3 million. So the whole nature of the labour market is going to change. And what we're saying to employers is it's not charity to take on older workers. Actually, your consumers, the grey pound and all of that, or the not very grey pound in this case, are that age group. If you've got people working for you who understand the market, you know, this is where all the action is going to be at. And the idea, as Steve says, there's this kind of cliff edge, you stop work at 58 and hope you've done enough, is going to go.
Is the fundamental issue when we talk about financing retirement still that we have a large section of the population that are going to reach retirement soon? They're going to have a very long and a very active and a very fulfilling retirement, and thank goodness for that. Yeah. What a triumph that is of science over nature. They've just not saved enough. How do any of these reforms address that fundamental issue?
I mean, for the people who are right on the brink of pension age retirement, call it what you will, we're still in the golden era to some extent where people are coming through with significant DB pension rights. And we looked at this as to whether the DB pension rights would drop out before the workplace pensions cut in. And actually, one of the curses of pension reform is it takes a generation to everything to work through. But actually, that's one of the blessings as well, because DB is still in the system for the next few decades. So there's quite a lot of people getting near pension age who are quite well provided for. Longer working is part of the mix, and then we need the next generation to have workplace pension saving. We need to get auto-enrolment not just finished, but beyond 8%. You know, so clearly we can ride on the past for a period, but we've now got to get the next generation through.
How can you, on one hand, say that people can be trusted with their own money, but on the other hand, say to younger workers, we trust you so little to save for the future, we're going to force you to save and auto-enroll you?
It's the difference between a 25-year-old and a 55-year-old. Try and talk to a 25-year-old about pensions and you've lost them. Talk to a 55-year-old about pensions and by and large they are very interested. So I'm prepared, as a Liberal, still to be paternalistic to a 25-year-old. You know, I've got teenagers. I'm prepared to say, I think it's in your best interest to put some money by for later. If I leave it to you, it ain't going to happen. I'm going to say I know what's best. I'm not going to say that to someone who's in their late 50s.
Steve, yes.
You've just said compulsion, right? This is not compulsion, what we've got. People can opt out of this. We've had compulsion.
They can, but they don't. It's
No,
relying.
well,
It's
sorry,
relying
that's the point
on,
I'm about to make in the denouement of my argument here. Right? We've had compulsion since 1961. Anybody who didn't have a pension scheme at work that passed muster had to have a second state pension provided by the state, an earnings-related, you know, a weird thing for the state to do, an earnings-related state pension. That was compulsory. You could not opt out of paying national insurance. We've got the opposite of compulsion now. We've got voluntary compulsion, if you like. We're only going to compel people who want to be compelled. The weird thing is that, by and large, young people don't opt out once auto-enrolled. In all sizes of schemes, we work with a large number of these firms. Young people don't opt out. The ones who are more likely to opt out are the older people, which is probably because of the things that Steve's already mentioned. They've already got enough head of steam behind them pension-wise that an extra few quid here and there won't make any difference. Young people aren't what you imagine. They're actually much more financially savvy than you and the rest of the media think.
That's not why the scheme was designed the way it was. It was designed as opt-out rather than opt-in because of the assumption, and it has been borne out, that young people are so disinterested in long-term financial planning, they wouldn't change the arrangements if they were made for them.
It's not true.
But that is what has happened.
I actually think that the fundamental issue here is one audience is Generation X, Y and Z, and the other audience is the baby boomers. And the government, and every elected government, plays to the baby boomers. And I think, sorry, we're saying it's okay because people in their 50s know what they're doing. So in Australia, why are people running up debts before they get into...
No, I didn't say that. I said they're engaged.
I know you didn't. I know you didn't.
Yes.
Steve P, sorry, did you want to come back in?
Well, I just think young people are better than we give them credit for. I think they are sensible. They do want to save, and they do want to sort their lives out. And I think we've got a pension system. You know, anyone who saves for a pension is doing the right thing, not just by themselves and their family, but by the rest of us. And what we need is a pension system that does right by them. And I think people now understand that that's what we've got.
Yes. What about the level of financial education and financial understanding? Is that strong enough? Is it thorough enough? Is it widespread enough to allow this liberalisation?
I've got some big issues on that because most of the people in the industry that I'm part of think that education means that we should explain to people the absolute nonsense that we've got. It's just pure rubbish. The education isn't explaining nonsensical stuff to people. It's explaining why you need to save, why you should look after yourself.
What do you mean by
options are.
Nonsensical stuff?
Our pension legislation is insultingly complex to the average person. It's far too hard to understand. Explaining that to them or putting it on the school curriculum or something like that is pointless. Absolutely. There's no point in teaching people pointlessness. But what you can do is explain to people why it makes sense to defer income, why it makes sense to average your, if you're going to live for until you're in your 80s and you intend to stop working in your 60s, then you've got to make every pay packet do an extra month or so. Those things can be explained, I think, well enough. And I think people are open to that explanation.
I mean, financial education is one of the very, very few things that have actually been put into the national curriculum in the last few years, and it was very popular, there's a lot of demand for that. And we've asked ourselves, where does pensions fit in all of this? And so I did a little experiment recently. I went to a secondary school and I tried to talk to a bunch of teenagers about pensions to see if they were comatose by the end. And they were very engaged with it. And one of the things that was clear was, as you say, Steve, we weren't trying to take them through the 2014 Pensions Act. But we were saying, actually, good though it was, classic of its type, but for a small fee later on, don't worry about it. But I sort of said to them, think about your grandparents. Okay, what do they live on? Where did that come from? What do you do when you? And part of the reason I was talking to sixth formers is actually 5 or 6 years. Hopefully they'll be in a job, they'll be auto-enrolled, and I simply want them to think, yeah, that's a good thing. I'm up for this. And I kind of think it's big picture stuff, it's not the detail.
Yeah, the only concern I have, and I'm all for financial education, the concern I have is, look, these are fantastically complicated subjects. I mean, longevity, we're all worried about investment, I'm worried about longevity. Explaining that to people, actually getting people to fundamentally understand it is very difficult. And we end up falling back on rules of thumb, such as we used to get in the industry that, well, put your money in the stock market over 10 years, it always beats cash. And then it stopped, and then we moved to 15 years, and then it stopped, and then we moved to 20 years. I just think when we go into financial education, we're not going to go anywhere near enough to really allow people to get to grips with the issues that they've got.
No, I disagree. Any school child, it doesn't have to be a sixth former, all you've got to do is show them a simple experiment anybody can perform, get a tin, put a £10 note in it, bury it in your garden, and dig it up 20 years later, right? And then the lesson you learn is that money doesn't travel that well through time, right? Pension schemes are time machines that you defer your income, you put money into it, and its job is to transport your money through time, hopefully without any loss of value, right? It's not a gambling machine that you win a lottery prize for investing at the right time, just when a star fund manager was, tying his shoes or something, all that nonsense, right? It's just, how do you transport money through time? If you choose to defer your income, how do you ensure that the 50 quid you've given up now will be worth 50 quid in 5 decades' time? And those things, I think, are easily explained.
Hang on, Neil. Stephanie was trying to get in.
Yeah, there are some great programs out there. You talk about the secondary school children, and Red Start, a program that was developed by Reddington, but a lot of asset managers and others in the industry have bought into it, are going into schools and teaching kids about finance, and not about the complexities of the system, but how do you budget, how do you set a goal, and how do you get towards that goal? And it's those fundamentals that will teach them. Interestingly, though, that exact same program can be used in workplace.
Can the financial services industry be trusted on financial education? Given all the scandals, why should we let any of you near any school?
Absolutely, they can be trusted. Absolutely, be trusted. I'm always disappointed when I hear of the one example or the two examples of the bad apples. The truth is, there's some really good work being done in the industry. Some really brilliant people, and some people who understand finance more than anyone else. And I think that's the true test of really understanding it, is being able to turn around and explain it to someone, and they understand what you're talking about.
We mentioned the level of innovation that's expected from the industry. Are investment managers clever enough to deliver that?
Absolutely, they are.
Sorry, by clever I mean, are they nimble enough? Are they?
They are, but I think there's a balance, and I think there are some who have rushed out with lots of innovative ideas in advance of all these changes in April, and then there's others who are a little bit more mindful to take their time and say, listen, what is it people want? How are they going to behave? And how can we deliver on that? And I don't think you can do that overnight. And as mentioned before, the solutions that are right for the people who are retiring next year and the year after are very different from the solutions that are going to be right for people in 10 years' time. And so the industry will be nimble, but I don't think there's an expectation that it's all going to be sorted out, but by the end of March.
We're just heading towards our final thoughts from the panel. Now, Neil, before we get there, are pensions even the right vehicle anymore for funding retirement?
Under this structure, yes, because I think now that you can have these multiple pots, you can do all different things. I do still favour for a basic rate taxpayer. I would still always say to people, you should consider putting your money into an ISA and then tipping it into a pension when you're a higher rate taxpayer, or just later on in life. I think that's a better proposition for quite a lot of people. I think the way the reforms are going, we're eventually going to see ISAs and pensions effectively becoming one in some description, and that's got to be a good thing.
Steve B, is there still a role for pensions?
Yeah, I think there's a role for long-term savings, there's a role for short-term savings, there's a role for mid-term savings. I think what we really need, I like the idea of ISAs and pensions becoming the same thing. What I really like is that when somebody puts money aside for the future, you should be able to say to them, they may be a 25-year-old in the workplace, you should be able to say to them, is that for your pension? Or is it for your long-term care? Or is it for your next holiday? Or is it for repairing your car? And they ought to be able to say to you, I don't know yet, I'll decide later. Right? If we had that much enlightenment, if we had a tax neutral, and I don't think it's tax relief, I think it's a tax neutral saving system where, like in quantum physics, when you look at an electron, it finally becomes real. When you finally look at your savings, you decide what they're to be used for, and the tax efficiency within the product is geared to that outcome. So if you decide you want to save it for your long-term care, we might give you more tax. You decide it's for your pension, we might leave it as pensions currently are. Or if you take it out early to have your car repaired or go on holiday, it might get what we currently call ISA rules. If that was the case, you wouldn't need this heavy-duty advice giving up front every time someone tries to save a pound. Right? The worst thing about advice in this country is that it's become expensive, difficult to get, and the advice is which silo you should save in for the future. Have no silos, no advice would be needed. We'd be a lot better off, and it'd be cheaper all round.
Stephanie.
advice will always be needed. Everyone's in such different circumstances and are coming from different perspectives, whether it's risk tolerance, their personal circumstances, or their goals. Advice is always going to be needed. And I think that, you know, pensions, ISA, that just adds to the complication and the value of the advisor, the role of the advisor.
The value, the cost of the advice, maybe not the value of it. And while you've got silos, there is value to it. But why should people decide when they save their money what they're going to spend it on? Why not have a cleverer product that can allow for the fact that they can do what they like with their own money, particularly as there's no chance that if they blow it, that they'd fall back on the rest of us for support?
Minister, is there a role for pensions? Are pensions the right vehicle?
I guess as Minister for Pensions, there's only one answer to that question. But I take Steve's point about flexibility. We consulted earlier in this Parliament on letting people access early some of their pension fund, which is in the spirit of what you're talking about. When we did so, there was very little positive response, though we weren't largely, government consultations don't get responded to by consumers on the whole.
You're asking the wrong people.
Well, yeah, I know, there is that danger. I think doing it in the middle of auto-enrolment, which would fundamentally change the product, was probably not the right time, but it's certainly something I think we need to readdress. Yeah.
And you mentioned long-term care and the costs of social care earlier.
Yeah.
I drew from what you said the inference that the government or the state will end up picking up most of those bills.
I think the challenge with long-term care is what the state provides is minimalist. So yeah, if I end up with nothing, I will probably get the most basic level of care in probably the cheapest place in the area I live in. And for most people, that's not going to be what they want. So yes, there is that safety net, but most people will want more than that. They'll want choice, they'll want quality. And so I think there's an awful lot of innovation to be done in these products. You know, if I've got a worthwhile capital pot, actually taking a lump out of that at 55, 60, handing it over to somebody and knowing then I've sorted out care in 20 years' time, for me, it's quite an attractive product. And in the past, the industry hasn't come up with these because it's worried about, you know, the tail. The government sort of dealt with the tail through the Dilmot cap to a point. So I think we'll see new products, and that's got to be a good thing.
So it is your expectation that people will save more to pay their own
yes,
social
I think they
care
will,
bills.
but I think they'll be buying quality, they'll be buying choice. I mean, there will always be, you know, essentially for the destitute, there will always be a floor, but that won't be good enough for most people.
Doesn't that increase the argument that people should hold back money rather than buying that Lamborghini?
But there's a difference between income and capital. So if you know, your regular income on the whole is never going to be within a country mile of paying for residential care costs. For me, residential care is a pure insurance issue. 3/4 of us won't need it. The quarter who do, we have to make sure that there's some, whether it's social insurance, private insurance, this is an insurance issue. It's not a matter of having 15 quid a week extra, because it's just not going to scratch the surface.
Okay. Last thought from each of the four of you. In a generation from now, what's the retirement landscape going to look like? Are we going to have fully funded, sustainable, comfortable retirements?
I think it'll be very diverse. I think we will have needed to have done more between now and then to get people saving enough, so, you know, get everyone in, but then get everybody up. I think it will start later, so it will start later and last longer, but I hope it will be more flexible, more free, and hopefully more satisfying.
Stephanie?
I think that in 10 years' time, we're going to see people with greater pots, and they're going to make use of that flexibility. And they're going to come to the realization that this is their money, and the importance of being able to save it and spend it the way they want in their retirement years.
Neil?
Yeah, I don't think we can imagine what the industry is going to be like in the next 5 years, because I think that these changes are just going to change the industry and change the products that we have in quite spectacular ways. What I will see in a generation time, though, is the baby boomers will have retired fully. They'll all be into their late ages. This is a generation that its anthem was, I hope I die before I get old. It's not a mantra for managing longevity.
But they won't be. They'll still be clinging on.
Well, yeah, exactly. So I don't know what the B-side of that record was. So.
Steve B.
Well, I'll be one of them. I don't care what the industry thinks, to be honest. I mean, the industry is irrelevant. I think what will happen is that we don't actually live a lot longer than we used to. It's just that more of us do, and ever more of us do, and will. I think the fact that we're all getting older is great news. I don't know why anybody would think there's anything to be negative about. And I think people will do what they do. And we've now got the state disentangled from our private pension savings, so we'll do great things.
Thank you to our panel, to Steve Webb, the Pensions Minister, to Stephanie Condra from AXA Investment Management, to Neil Lovatt from Scottish Friendly, and Steve B from Jargonfree Benefits. Thank you very much. I hope you've enjoyed the stimulating discussion that they've given us today.